Greetings, welcome, namaskara. We are on to the fascinating world of translating, translation, and transmuting knowledge from various worlds and verticals of lived-in experiences. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of warriors of prose and poetry, artisans of lived experience, as Ranjit himself described his work. These are people who make, pardon the euphemism, but these are people who make time-space travel with words seem seamless. And these are people who break barriers of dialect and sometimes use the very barriers to scaffold and orbit prose and poetry into higher levels of exalted meaning. And we're here today having a discussion about what it takes to translate. What are the processes, what are the predicaments, what are the dialects, and the dilemmas that come with this process of translation. So right off the bat, in your book, you mention this word called emotional immediacy. And I'm sure you'll agree that the work of a translator is so conscious and so deliberate and so self-reflective at every point in the process. And it is sometimes so far removed from this perhaps spontaneous outpouring of genius by the author who first created that text or poetry, that it is so removed from that emotional immediacy that perhaps engendered that poetry. So how do you and there's tension in that process. So as a poet yourself and as a translator, you've straddled many roles. How do you see that tension? And drawing from your previous books, the one on Laleshwari or Lalder, and the one on Mir Taki Mir, has Ranjit Hoskote been, has it been a struggle to actually be present and absent at the same time?
Thanks so much. Well, in the first place, it's marvelous to be here in Mysuru and at this gathering of people who are committed to reading and to writing and to listening. And thank you for the question that is going to start us off on this panel. I want to say in the first place that there really is no spontaneous output. There is some spontaneous outpouring there, which someone might want to stop. But, usually when people think about spontaneous outpouring, they're reflecting on Wordsworth. But he goes on to say spontaneous outpouring, or whatever it is he said, recollected in tranquility. So to me, that's the more important part of the poetic process. It's not about just spontaneously putting out whatever comes to you. It's also crafting what comes to you in terms of cadence, musicality, how you layer what you're saying. So when I'm responding, whether to Lala or to Mir Taki Mir, I'm not just responding to some spontaneous outpouring there. I'm also attentive to what they do with cadence, what they do with meter, how they deal with the techniques they inherit and what techniques they create. So I wrote this in my introduction to the Lalder translation, that the translator is broken and remade in the process of translation. So for me, it's not so much about being either present or absent. I'm, if anything, fully present, but to me, it's a wager on transformation. Yeah, so when I translate, I enter a liminal, a threshold space, where I hope to be remade, to discover new dimensions. So it's about discovering common ground between yourself and whose work you're working on.
Excellent. Your work looks at, and you describe your work as quintessential representation of Bengal, right?
Yeah.
And when I spoke to you the other day, you were referring to this sort of hierarchical cognitive unity that exists in the human capacity of knowledge and language. where even though there are non-translatables, there are things which are so located and socially constructed, you can use the devices of language, perhaps another language, to somehow find common ground. And it's sort of, like you said, language is like a river, and it does find its ocean. So could you reflect on that aspect of your
Deepti,
journey?
and I'm delighted to be here and very, very happy to be in Mysore for a festival, a city I'd visited many years ago, and it remains the same and different at the same time. So as we begin today's panel, it's important to remember that when you translate, you are straddling sort of, I find it's a precipice. You're walking on edge because you can't be disloyal to the voice that you're translating. At the same time, you have to make sense to a readership you're writing for. And that is something which I find we were constantly jostling for, or finding that balance, the right balance. And that is a lot of fun at the same time. So when you speak about language finding its place or its flow as a river, that's what I exactly found practically when I was doing it. I mean, Bengali is a language of a lot of cadence, a lot of musicality, and a lot of phonetic sounds. You know, the word, when you talk about, I write, my translation is about ghost stories, which relates to, I mean, from everyone, all across the world, people have been somehow motivated by them, fascinated by them, and mystified by the idea of the supernatural, the afterlife, ancient funerary objects, starting from, you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh has the ghost. There's Plautus's first play was The Haunted House. So there's a lot of oral history which is there. So there is a common ground. There is myth, there is lore which is there. But each time a writer interprets it or a person interprets it, it's your personal idea. So when you're walking that road, you have to find a way to transmute, as you said, or, you know, go from one side to the other. In holding on to the present, but yet reflective of the past, is what I found, because I translated a set of 11 writers who were very different. There was Tagore, there was Vibhuti Bhushan, yet there were unknown people. Jogesh Chandra Bandyopadhyay, who's the title of my story, The Phantom Towel, is not a very well known, but yet those stories were just as exciting and just as puzzling to me as a translator as I was doing it. And so, yeah, the language finds its way, is what I think. It doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be completely to the point that you need it to be, and it will find its way as you go along. And you may change the nuance, you may change the context a bit, that suits you as, and I just was listening to Deepa Bhashti's session, and what she said, that a third text emerges. That is so true. There is the original, there's the translator's interpretation, and there's the third text, which is what I find as you refined and polished as we went along. So, yeah.
Fabulous. And you mentioned phonetic difficulties.
Yes, yes.
Isn't it, when we spoke about it?
Yes.
Can you, be it any language?
Yes, I can talk about Bengali. There is a word in Bengali which says when you're reading a scary story, or you're reading something which is making you feel a chill down your spine, and you say, ga chom chom. So which means that I can't even translate it. It is quite not spine chilling, and yet it is. So there are lots of this, you know, matha jim jim, where your head is feeling a bit heavy, you're feeling slightly unwell, but you're not quite there. So I think this is there for every language. I'm sure you'd agree. This is everywhere there is this. And again, when you translate it, you do feel maybe you've lost something in the process, but you don't. As long as your reader is able to get that cadence and get the atmosphere, I think you're there.
And Ranjit, you were also mentioning whether it's Sanskrit prose or even Kannada. To give an example, in the Shivatandava Stotra, a lot of the phonetic majesty comes from the non-traceable cadences. Dhagad 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 jwalal lalata patta pavake, or dhamad 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 dhaman ninadavad dhamarvayam, or even in drawing from Kannada, swaragakke kichu hachenda sarvagna, right? So it is so much the cadence, the accent pattern, which drives the meaning. And so in your works, with both Mir Taki Mir and Laleshwari, how did you approach these? Because it's very difficult to keep alliterative structure
You probably can't, I think, all the time.
So you make these hard choices, and like any musician or a painter, the choices you don't make speak more eloquently than the ones you do make. So if you could reflect on that.
Maybe three ways of approaching that question. The first is a question I almost always get. Someone will stand up and say, "Is yours a literal translation?" Yeah? It's typically someone who's never translated anything, but never mind. So over time, and hard knocks have come to the answer, which is there are no literal originals. So there can be no literal translations. Because every text is complex, it's doing multiple things. It's not as if it has a first order surface meaning. Yeah? So when you're responding to it, you're also probing its complexities, you're going into its depths, you're being tricked and ambushed by the original author, and you have to find your way out of that. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other comes from my friend and colleague Daisy Rockwell, who's also had to deal with this problem, of course. So when someone comes up to her and says, "What is lost in translation?" she responds by saying, "Everything. Everything is lost in translation." And then you start from the ground up. That's a very American pioneering DIY spirit that I greatly admire. But I think there's much truth to that. So, there's no way you're going to carry the phonetics, especially this. Shunandani's bravely attempted this in her translations by maintaining the kind of doubling that we have, for instance. I mean, Gujarati, falana dikna. I mean, how are you going to translate that? You just have to find your own ways of creating a new music in the language that you're working with. Yeah, so this is how I would respond. Because if you try and maintain those original cadences, the chances are you will come up with something that sounds comic.
Atrocious, yeah, sometimes, yes. Yep, beautifully said. Finding new music and finding ground zero. After all, we invented zero, isn't it? So it's a powerful place for a translator. So, so let's move on to the idea of your book. Mir Takimir does reposition his body of work. And you mentioned in your book that he was somewhat eclipsed by his more successful successor, for the lack of a better word, Mirza Ghalib. And your book sort of brings back, repositions his work, and you've carefully selected only 150 ashars. And can you talk about how, and then you also mentioned that the 18th century was somewhat of a forgotten era in the literary space that pervaded that geography. So can you talk about translating, and the literary repositioning of past works? And
I came to Mir through Ghalib, actually. I've spent years working on Ghalib. And at some point, I stumbled on the fact, I'd known it always, but it became very manifest to me that Ghalib, who was incredibly arrogant, as we know, very conscious of his own sophistication, acknowledged only one master, and that was Mir. So, and that kind of opened the door to Mir for me. Also, I'd been aware of some of his work, known of his history. We've read our Ralph Russell and so on, and he was available in a certain way. But as I read his work through Farooqi Saab's lens, through the lens of Francis Pritchett, I always find that as translators, as poets, as scholars, we are constantly building on the work of those who've gone before us. Nothing begins in a vacuum. There's always a tradition of researchers and scholars, poets, translators who've gone before us. So I see myself as working in that critical and empathetic tradition. Yeah. But it became very clear to me that for whatever reason, Mir had been labeled within Urdu criticism as a poet of lost love and endemic sorrow and so on. But the evidence of the poems was something else. Here is someone who is playful, who could be contrarian, and who really was a very strong political consciousness. So through Mir, it came to me that actually one should really rethink this whole idea of the ghazal universe as being simply concerned with golo bulbul, gardens, birds, love, etc. There is, of course, that whole layer. But the ghazal, especially in the 18th century and the 19th, is also a vehicle for the articulation of profound trauma and displacement. And when you look at his life, you realize that, Mir is literally our contemporary. This is someone who is living in a world that is breaking down around him. There are no certainties. He's displaced twice over. He has to leave. There's a large, if you look at his biographical timeline, he's thought of as a Delhi poet. But actually, he spends about a decade in the Jat strongholds in Kumair, in Deeg, comes back, and then finally goes to Lucknow. And in every way, this is someone who's coping with the disruption of a world and the disruption of a self. Yeah? So it was all those dimensions of his work that appealed to me, and that's what I try to bear witness to. It's also a way of thinking through how one should be able to balance the political context of work with whatever the aesthetic and formal questions might be. I think we tend to move to one or the other extreme. I think the critical challenge here is to figure out this interplay.
Fabulous. And I'd like to quote a small excerpt from your book to preface my question to Arundhati. You mentioned that literary appeal does not transmit itself. It's a very, very powerful sentence, mid-paragraph, I must say. But literary appeal does not transmit itself in a vacuum. And you mentioned vacuum in your response. It must be mediated through those channels of publication, interpretation, and dissemination that make a poet's work widely available and accessible. And in this regard, translation and translating, the role of translation and translating in the whole activism, world of literary activism can't be underscored enough. And so with that preface, your book mentions that it's perhaps the first of its kind collection of anthology of translated works
No, it's
in
not,
Bengali.
certainly not the first of its kind, but the time period that I chose was very particular, between the early sort of mid-19th to the mid-20th. And it was a journey of nostalgia and discovery, both for me, because these were stories, a lot of it which we had grown up on. And my grandmother was this raconteur. She would always be having visitations by spirits and ghosts, whether she imagined some or she created to entertain us, but they used to hold us in thrall through these long afternoons. So when I had my own children, I would read these out to them with trying to make notes in English, so making it out to be palatable into a more modern, younger readership. And I realized these are gems, and they'll die out if nobody reads them. And half the reason we translate is also because we are discovering a treasure trove which we don't want to let go of. If people are not going to read these stories, let's get them to read. And most of them were nostalgic, but I found facets because I was reading as a much older person. The same stories which I read as a child, and some were new. And each time I found, there is so much literary excellence which would have probably gone unsaid if he didn't bring them out in a way that would appeal now. A lot of it was dated. A lot of it may not have been politically correct. Vibhuti Bhushan's stories, there was a lot of patriarchy, sort of patriarchal mentions of this girl he's talking to. I had to keep tweaking it or refining it in a way that it would still work. But it wasn't easy. But it wasn't hard, because at the heart of it, the stories appeal to me. I think at the end of the day, when a translator takes up something, the story has to speak to your soul. You have to be feeling that motivation that, yes, this is something which needs to be told, and this is something which talks to me. And then you can find a voice somewhere in between. And you have to keep changing your voice, as I was saying to you earlier. You have to keep changing.
I noticed you said it's easy and it's not so hard.
It is.
And it's not so easy and it's not so hard.
Yeah, it's easy because you like the stories, you're comfortable in both these tongues. I think that is very important, your mastery of the tongue you're going to translate into, and your nuances of the original. You have to know both very well. You have to feel them from the inside, right. Massage them in that way. So I think that is important. But at the same time, it's hard because you don't know whether this is going to be, gelling with the more modern readership, as I keep saying, which my editor kept telling me, that ensure that people will read. It shouldn't be that it's a ghost story and it's fun and you read it as a child and it's all lost. No, it has to work. It has to have an edge. It has to have some sort of that, some fire. And that's what I think something every writer has to look at. So,
Absolutely.
and be true to the original at the same time. I think a translator's work is much harder than when you write from your heart and you're writing a story, you're crafting something original. You have the bare bones in your mind and you're giving it flesh. But here you are presented with something which is already you're reverential towards, right? And you have to tread carefully. And that is where I say it's both easy and hard.
Yeah, like you mentioned, they say that humor, right?
Yes.
Fear,
Yeah.
and horror, these are extremely difficult rasas, as they say, or bhayanaka or bhivatsa. These are very difficult rasas to actually translate across various forms. And in many ways, I sense when I read your book, there's a quiet rebellion.
Because you are trying to, as I said, language flows like a river. You even if you're controlled by form, it will not stop. It's going to find its way, and in the way, it needs to find itself. And that I found, as you speak about humor, the Bengali ghost story is full of humor. There is not that much, the horror element doesn't exist. It's some sort of subliminal fear. And then there is humor, which I found was even harder to get because it wasn't slapstick. I was asked by a critic that, you keep saying there's humor in these stories. I haven't found the humor. I had no answer. I said, well, you couldn't. I guess it's a cultural issue. I can't help it.
Lost in translation. Everything is lost in translation and found later, isn't it?
So, always found, I think.
And found perhaps at a higher orbit of existence later.
Let's not make it too high, otherwise we'll be spirits by the time it's found.
I was hoping you will fall for that. So, Ranjit, coming to this, in your book, I see, and I read a lot about, in your sort of analysis, interpretive analysis of Meer's work, I see that there's a lot of attention paid to unseating the binaries that existed in that place in time, and looking at this binary between Urdu and Hindi, and Urdu being a Muslim language, for the lack of a better way to word it, and then the influence of the Dakhni in his works. And so looking at these binaries and in time and space, can you just reflect on the unseating binaries part of the translational work?
It's not just unseating binaries, it's actually actively questioning, confronting, and trying to dismantle these misconceptions that are just now being taken to be normal. I mean, exactly what you said. The entire campaign to somehow isolate Urdu from the larger patterns of South Asia and to make it look like it is, first of all, completely untrue, that it comes from somewhere else. Secondly, the idea that it is specific to a particular community. I mean, the fact of it is that it's a language that is constant, has been in a state of evolution for the last few centuries. Even the name that it's known by, Urdu, is a name that Ghalib never called his language Urdu, neither did Meer. It's only in 1780 that for the first time someone uses that word. Before that it was called Hindavi, or it was called Dakhni. I think what we really need to do is to look empirically at history instead of being seduced by ignorant ideologues and demagogues. So that's the first step. Yeah, the othering is what we need to question, because if you look at the history of Urdu, you realize that it has multiple origins. One of the fatal assumptions in cultural history is that everything has a single origin. Nothing has a single origin. Yeah? So what we are today calling Urdu actually began everywhere. It began in the camps of armies in the north. It began among saints and merchants in the south. It flourished in the west. There's no part of this country which hasn't contributed to it. Yeah? So if you stop this belligerent, antagonistic way of thinking about languages, and I'm sorry, but I think this policy of linguistic states was a categorical error. It was a cultural disaster, and it's produced foolish regional xenophobia in this country. Yeah? So get away from that and go back to the history of what this looks like. You'll suddenly see, as I argue in the book, that you need to look at what I'm calling the Hindavi continuum. It's a set of interrelated languages which go from Rajasthan to Telangana, and from the hills in the north down to Aurangabad and across the north. So, and the language that we officially now call Hindi is about 100 years old. It comes out of the pages of a journal called Saraswati, and it marks a very particular historical solution. But if you look beyond that, you'll see that there are languages which is why, by the way, I don't like that word dialect. It's not a meaningful word. As someone once said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy to support it. You know? So you have languages like Magahi, Malvi, Maithili, Avadhi, Braj. All these are now described as dialects of Hindi. They're not dialects. They are languages with very rich and robust literatures in written form, in performance, in prayer, in hymn, in critical narrative. Yeah? So my argument here is for us to look at Urdu as part of this Hindavi continuum, with its engagements with Persian on the one side and its engagements with many of these languages that I talked about. And Mir, in his historical moment, is actually the embodiment of these things, because in his language you see how he's playing between Farsi and Khadi Boli. He has Braj, he has Avadhi. There's all kinds of things going on. Speaking of Dakhani, by the way, there is also a certain way in which people think about Dakhani as a very southern thing. The fact is there's a lot of Punjabi in it. There's Punjabi, there's languages of the north, because you're looking at a language that evolves at an interface when people from different regions come together. The history of the subcontinent is a history of migrations. It's not a history of people rooted in one place at any time.
And that explains the title of your book, The Homelands, an Ocean, isn't it? And I think I remember reading in your book that perhaps Mir himself thought that he was writing in Hindi.
That's what he called his language.
And that's paradoxical and perplexing at the same time. And if you would read out this. Yeah.
And he's very aware of this. So he writes in this verse, क्या जानूं लोग कहते हैं किसको सुरूर कल्ब आया नहीं ये लफ्ज़ तो हिंदी ज़बान के बीच. How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance? That posh word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet. You know, I have to open out and explain a little bit in English, because to his original listeners, it was very clear that he's making fun of the high Persianate register, the Perso-Arabic of surur kalb. And he laughs at that. He says, this word hasn't come into Hindi yet. Yeah. So for me, this is a very crucial verse, because it really dramatizes this question of linguistic choice, of multiplicity within language. And a generation later, you see how Ghalib actually takes this surur kalb route, becoming very, very Persian. In fact, Ghalib thought he was a Persian poet doing people a favor by writing in Urdu occasionally. That is how he saw himself.
Fabulous. You actually translated 11 writers, and many of them, some very well-known storytellers, mature storytellers like Tagore, and then 3 writers who you discovered,
I discovered
from a previous anthology. Yeah. And so clearly, how do you, in that scenario, how do you choose a voice that is consistent across the stories so that there is some,
there is no consistency across the stories that I can be. I can't be a consistent, it's not my voice. So I have to, of course I am there in terms of somebody who's modulating and moderating the language at my will so that it makes sense. But with 11 writers of such very different genres, different types rather, not genres, different types of storytellers, I can't have a consistent voice. So I had to keep doing that, which is what I found was a very intellectually challenging exercise. You know, for instance, Tagore's ghost stories are cerebral at the same time, while they carry a lot of the weight of emotion. There's a story of a woman's identity. It's called Skeleton in my translation. It's called the Konkal. It's a woman who's now a skeleton, and she's being studied as an anatomical specimen by 3 schoolboys. And she comes to one of them and she's talking. And she talks about her life. And she was widowed. She was vilified by society, by a very patriarchal society. She led an isolated life in a lonely house with her brother. She fell in love and she wanted to remarry. So this whole story is being sort of told as a skeleton to this little, I won't give this a spoiler out, but yeah. But it wasn't a straightforward story. His language, his tenor, his whole voice is different from, say, somebody called Amarendra Munshi, who I discovered while I was going through these many anthologies while I was researching. And it was called Inside the Water Spinach Forest Marsh, which is again the story of a girl, a young girl, who decided to row her boat against the wishes of her family and drowned. And on one moonlit night, she reappears again to a 15-year-old boy. And she talks about how she was trying, if you read deep, she was trying to break away from the shackles of patriarchy. She wasn't allowed to row. She was asked to stay at home, cook meals, and be what a girl of 15 needed to be, and be ready to be married. But she didn't do that. She said the water spinach forest, the marsh over there, was her shoi. The word shoi in Bengali means dearest friend. And she said, the water called out to me like a shoi. I had to row my boat. So both these tales were different. Voices were different, yet there were tales of quiet rebellion, as I discovered as I read them. So.
Fabulous. Do you have an excerpt that you would like to share with us? I know I've been told I have 10 minutes, and we will have some time for questions and interactions with the audience, but would love to hear. Yeah.
I could actually, I was thinking of reading from a more well-known story, which is The Famished Stone or The Hungry Stone, Khudito Pashan by Tagore, because that might be better known to the audience here. Though everybody should just buy the book to know the lesser-known writers from Bengal. But I think I was just going to read about this. Everybody's seen the film, the Khudito Pashan is a famous film. Uttam Kumar acted in it, and it has been remade in Hindi. It's a story of this man who meets 2 people on a train, and he describes his time as the governor's assistant, as an overseer in a district in Madhya Pradesh, and he was staying in a derelict, decrepit home, a palace by a riverbed, where he has these visitations. And he thinks he's chasing this historical sort of maiden beside a river, and he can hear many things, he sees many things, and now he transforms into a different persona at night. So I'll just read a little bit of that. When dusk descended, I would spiral into the web of an out-of-body experience. I would find myself transforming into a magnificent historical personage who belonged to an unwritten tale of a bygone, hundreds of years old era on whom staid Western attire didn't feel appropriate. I would dress myself carefully with a red velvet fez on my head, loose pajamas, a floral tunic, an oversized silk cloak like a choga, and spray ether on my colored handkerchief. I would replace my cigarettes with a long-stemmed hubble bubble whose multiple lighting holes I would fill with rose water. Dressed like this, I would seat myself on an armchair piled high with cushions, eager and prepared for a resplendent night of revelry among close friends of the royalty. As the darkness would deepen each night, the events of what would unfold are so unbelievable that I can't even describe them. It was as if the stray parts of a fantastic story would wander about the palace, swayed by a cool spring breeze. You could see and chase them for a while, but never find the conclusion. And I would follow these tantalizing moving parts around the palace the entire night. During these dreamy enactments of those unfinished segments, I would smell a smattering of henna, hear a strain of sitar, and in the midst of this fragrant air, laden with the friction of anticipation, I would spot quicksilver glimpses of my enigmatic leading lady. It was the same woman of the saffron pajamas whose feet I had seen before, the same rosy-hued alabaster feet, encased in slippers of golden brocade, curved at the top. Her chest was secured tightly by a heavy floral brocade corset. On her head rested a red cap from which hung a fringed veil to guard her forehead and cheeks.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Struck by the amazing richness of detail in that.
I think that's another problem you face as a translator. How do you bring each detail to life? Yeah, the mosaic, there's a whole tapestry in front of you, which must resonate with everyone who's reading. I think that. Yeah.
Sometimes more is less, and less is more.
Yes, less is more. Actually.
Spoken like a true translator there. You.
Okay. Maybe I'll just read a couple of the mere translations. Yeah. This is the verse that opens the book. शायर हो, मत चुप के रहो, अब चुप में जाने जाती हैं. बात करो, अब्यात पढ़ो, कुछ बातें हमको बताते रहो. You're a poet. Don't be silent. Lives are lost under cover of silence. Speak up, read a couple of lines, read us verses, keep talking to us. And I think that really spells out a manifesto for what we should do. And maybe just one more. Or if there's time later.
We have 5 minutes. Yeah. I'd like to keep talking to us was the last few words in his. Yeah, sure.
Just one more. उसके फरोग़ हुस्न से झमके है सब में नूर, शमे हरम हो या हो दिया सोमनाथ का. Its splendid beauty sets all things shimmering with light, whether it's the lantern of the Kaaba or the lamp of Somnath. Again.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ranjit.
Thank you.
The floor is open. I request people to keep your questions and responses brief and located in today's theme. Someone there?
Can you hear me? So I had a question about translation in the sense of the marginalized. So for example, there's someone who's writing, a Dalit woman is writing about her struggle. And there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of class struggle there, there's a lot of, in the sense there's a lot of pain in that writing. Say there's a white man or like an upper caste person who's trying to translate that text. How do you think, because they're so distanced from that reality of class struggle or the ability to sort of form a resistance, how do you think they would be able to translate the text and maintain the sanctity of that pain and of that resistance? Do you think there's a challenge there, or do you think it's really important to be politically connected to that world of theirs, and can they ever preserve the voice of that text, is my question.
Well, I think in the hands of an able and a sensitive translator, I don't see why it can't be, because even when you write about themes as a writer, you may write about topics which are alien to you, which you research, right? Everything you do is built on a very hard and a very meticulous body of research. So if you are sensitive and you have the acumen to feel, I don't see why it is hard. Yes, it is a distance. It's a distance you have to traverse. You have to overreach yourself many times to understand that nuance. But I don't think it's hard to. I mean, in fact, this was there in the session with Deepa. She was also asked this in one of the questions. So would you like to take this here?
I just want to, if I may, just frame your question in a larger debate. There's constantly the sense now that, on the liberal side, that my trauma or my history is so unique to me that no one else can understand it. Yeah? So whether it's I'm Dalit or queer or whatever it might be, that there's a specificity to that which cannot be understood by someone who doesn't share that history. On the other hand, you have the forms of xenophobia that the right is producing, which also rests on ultimately a similar assumption that my history is unique and superior, and no one else can understand that. So the thing with translation is that it actually questions both of these sides. And it really is, as far as I can tell, translation is a project in xenophilia. It urges you to release yourself towards something that is not you and to dismantle yourself in that process. Yeah. So I recognize that there are very precise, practical, and affective problems with trying to translate someone's work where you don't share those cultural or political assumptions. But I think what might help there is if you see yourself not as someone achieving mastery, but as an apprentice to the historical crisis, to the language, to the forms of the language even. Because Dalit writing across South Asian languages also uses linguistic registers and vocabularies that are not available to people who are conventionally taught those languages. So there again, you have to put yourself in the place of an apprentice to the writer and the text. Yeah, so these are lessons in humility, which it's actually a good thing if you can manage it.
I think empathy came up twice in both of their responses. So I think the translator's world is a very empathetic process. We have time for just one more question. Yeah.
This is a question to Mr. Ranjit. Here, right in the... Lalleshwari or lauded is a very, very well-known poet in Kannada also. For example, the practice is to compare her with Akka Mahadevi. And such comparisons have appeared quite majorly. And Lalleshwari has also been translated into English by quite a few people. Being a very sensitive reader and a poet yourself, I am sure you have read the earlier translations. How different is... Yeah. How different is your translation?
How different is it? Yeah. My God, we don't really have time for this in detail, but I'll say two things. One is I'm actually quite skeptical about this tendency to compare figures from one part of the country with their specific history with another. I mean, unfortunately, that connection between Lalla and Akka Mahadevi rests on the slightly dubious idea that they both wandered naked. You know, this is not very meaningful. If you look at the theological and other details, they actually come from quite different standpoints. Also, the reason I'm skeptical of this idea of saying these are all bhakti poets, you know, it's so abstract that it doesn't mean anything. To me, the work of Lalla comes from a very particular intersection between a Trikha, a Kashmir Shaiva tradition, and the beginnings of Sufism in the valley. Yeah? So there are specificities there that we need to respect instead of just blurring it all up. And why is my translation different? You're sounding like a publisher who's asking for a pitch, you know? What is different about your... it's actually quite simple. I grew up reading and hearing Lalla. But the difference is that I had to work against the grain of a tradition of translation which rests on a very Orientalist 19th century kind of register and tonality. So I wanted to restore to these varks, these verses, their original energy, a lot of which is robust and demotic. Yeah? And because precisely the linguistic register, the evidence tells us it's not the work of a single person. So even within the varks, there are different voices, different tonalities. And my mandate, my dharma really, was to be true to those different registers and voices. Yeah? So that was what I was trying to do, and to do it in a contemporary idiom.
All right. Thank you. I think I am being shown the gesture.